coming up, and I will be accepting questions throughout this presentation. So if I mention something that triggers a question for you, please feel free to submit that through the Q&A function in Zoom. And we will either answer it right away, or we may save some of them to be answered at the end. So don't hesitate to put questions out there. I'd also like to start off by thanking my colleague Hannah Zerko for being on this meeting as well. She is on the back end of the video, making sure that everything goes smoothly. And if we have any Zoom connection issues and I get bumped off for any reason, she is going to jump in and take over until I'm able to reconnect. So hopefully we don't have to do that, but we do have a plan in place just in case that does occur. All right, so from today's workshop, there should be three main things that you'll be able to walk away with. The first thing is a better understanding of the importance of understanding the perspective of the interviewer, and we'll talk about some ways that you can go about doing that. You're also going to learn some of the different types of interview questions that you could face in an employment interview. And that when we talk about employment, I'm talking about both full-time work, but also internships as well. So this is helpful for anyone who's thinking about applying for anything that's going to require an interview. And then finally, we'll talk about some ways that you can start to develop answers to some of the common interview questions that you feel prepared to perform well in an interview setting. Today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the content of interviews and not necessarily the format. So what we talk about today will pertain to in-person interviews, phone interviews, Zoom interviews, or digital interviews, recorded interviews. But if you have questions about the platform, maybe you have a virtual interview coming up and you're not really sure how that might be different than an in-person interview, we do actually have a webinar that we have recorded from earlier in the summer that walks you through some of the details of that. And so I recommend that you look up the Texas Career Engagement webinar about virtual interviewing if you do have questions. All right, so we'll start with understanding the interviewer's perspective. And this is something that seems fairly obvious. They're the person that is evaluating your answers. They're the person who may be making the decision about whether you move on to a final round interview or even get the offer extended to you. So it's clearly important to understand what they might be looking for. But how do you go about doing that? And how do you make sure that as you're answering your interview questions, you're keeping that in your mind? Interviews can be a somewhat stressful time for some of us, and so it can be hard to remember that we need to focus on that interviewer's perspective. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we can prepare for that, and so it's hopefully not as difficult when you actually have an interviewer in front of you and you are answering their questions. The first thing that you need to do when you're preparing for an interview is to do your research. And this is going to involve research about the organization, but also about the interviewer themselves. The first thing that I recommend interviewing is the mission and values of that organization. A lot of organizations have clearly defined mission and values that guides who they are. It can help guide their corporate culture. If it's an organization that takes those values or mission very strongly, those are very strong values or mission for them, you're probably going to see them use a lot of that language, not only in the interview, but in their everyday communication with each other. And so it's important that you have that language and that you're able to use that in your interview as well. It shows that you understand what they're about. It shows that you might already be a good fit before you even get into the organization. And so whenever you have an interview coming up, I recommend looking up their mission and values and trying to maybe not memorize them, but keep them in your mind as you're going through your answers and your research. Another thing that I recommend looking up as much as you can is the culture of an organization. And culture is probably going to be a little bit trickier to find online because there's not going to be a whole lot of language on the website that likely accurately describes the culture for the employees who work there. And so you may have to look at a few other sources for that information. I recommend using websites like Glassdoor that allow employees to make reviews of organizations. I do encourage you to be a little bit skeptical or thorough when you're looking at some of those reviews, because sometimes folks will write reviews if they're really angry, and it may not be completely reflective of an organization. But if you look at a number of reviews and there seem to be some common themes, and that's a pretty good indication that that may be, in fact, truly a part of that culture. And it could be positive, or it could be something that may not reflect so well on the organization. But I think it's important for you to know going in what employees who work there are thinking about that organization and about their employer. Another piece that's important to research is the leadership of the organization. So who is the president or the CEO? Who is on the board? That information should probably all be available on their website, but if you can only get a few names, but there's not much else about those individuals, I would definitely recommend just Googling them, see if they pop up in news stories, see what kinds of interviews they've done or what they have published or what information is out there about them. Again, because leadership will oftentimes set the tone for a culture, and you can get a good sense of what that leadership team really values, and then hopefully integrate that into your interview answers. And then finally, on this slide, I recommend that you do some research about your organizational connections. Do you happen to have any connections for anyone who works in that organization, or even better, on the exact team that you're interviewing for, who can provide you some insight into some of these things that you may not have been able to find online? If you can talk to someone who works at that organization, you can ask them about the culture and hear specifically what it is that they perceive when they are at work. You can ask them about some of the missions and values. What is the language that is used oftentimes to express what's important to this organization? And then again, integrate that into your interview answers. But you don't just want to do interview research on the organization or the company. You also want to make sure that you are doing a little bit of research on your interviewer. And when I talk to students about this, a lot of times they'll get a little bit nervous because it feels, for lack of a better term, it can feel a little creepy to be looking at the background of your interviewer. But I assure you that if you're doing it in a professional way, it actually is a really good thing, and it can work in your favor. So whenever you get a call for an interview, you are asked to do an interview, you are always welcome to ask questions of the individual who's extending that interview offer to you. And I recommend that one of the questions that you ask, if they don't volunteer it, is to find out who will be interviewing me. Can I ask the name of the interviewer or interviewers who I will be talking with? So that way, before you even get on the interview, you know exactly who is going to be on the other end of that phone call or that Zoom call, or who will be in the room when you walk in. And you'll have those names. And then I recommend that you look them up on LinkedIn. And I think this is where students get a little nervous. You may or may not be aware that LinkedIn has a setting where if you look someone up on LinkedIn, it will show them that you looked them up. You can turn this setting off, but I recommend that you don't. I recommend that you look up your interviewer to get a sense of what is their position about. Maybe you can learn a little bit more than just their job title based on the description they have on LinkedIn. Maybe you can learn a little bit about the positions they've had before that. Maybe you find out that the individual who is hiring you actually had this role that you're interviewing for before they were promoted up. You can ask them about their experience in the role that you're hoping to get. Or you can learn a little bit about maybe where they're from, or if they've listed other organizations they're involved with, to get a sense of where their interests lie. And they're probably going to see that you looked them up. And that is a good thing, I promise. It shows that you are taking the initiative. It shows you're interested in the position, that you're doing your research, that you're responsible. And so I certainly would not ever feel the need to hide that when I'm looking at an interviewer. And I encourage students to not hide that as well. There are other places that you can look up your interviewer. Again, looking to see if they've been quoted in any news articles or maybe press releases about the organization. But LinkedIn is a really great place to start. Something else that I recommend doing is making sure that you fully understand who the decision maker is in the hire. A lot of times interviews will have multiple interviewers sitting in, and they will probably all be asked for their feedback or their perspective on you as a candidate, but one of them will be the one who makes that final decision. They'll take all of the feedback into account. And so make sure you know who that is, and so that you can make sure to tailor your answers to address this third bullet here. Show how you will make their life easier as their employee, as their coworker, as somebody who is on their team. Your job is to show them why you're a good fit, how that's going to positively impact that organization and them specifically, if their particular role intersects with the role that you're interviewing for. All right, and then the last thing that I recommend doing when you're talking about researching or preparing is to make sure you review that job posting again. One tip that I always give students is that before you click submit on any application that you are turning in, make sure that you save even if it's a screenshot or a PDF of that job description before you submit. Because there's a good chance that by the time you're requested to come in for an interview, that job posting will be taken down and you won't be able to go back and look at it. So you just save a copy of all of the all of the job postings that you're applying to. You can easily go into that folder and find it and review it before your interview. You're going to find a lot of the skills and qualifications that they are looking for and specifically asking for in that job posting. And then you'll find ways to integrate that into your interview answers as you're talking with them. Finally, and one last piece that I encourage you to think about and look at is the format of the interview. Sometimes the format of the interview is chosen intentionally to show them a little bit more about who you are as a candidate. So if they're asking you to do a presentation as part of your interview, they're probably not only evaluating the content of that presentation, but also your presentation skills. So you want to make sure that you've done a good job practicing your presentation, that you feel confident in your public speaking ability. If they're asking you to do maybe an interview via a tech tool like Zoom, but maybe it's a brand new tech tool and you're unfamiliar with it, they may also be evaluating how technologically savvy you are. So don't take anything for granted. Make sure you feel fully confident in the format of the interview, in addition to the answers and the content that you're going to be providing. So what types of things will the interviewers be looking for? There are four major groups that they will be evaluating when they are talking to an interviewee. The first one is personality. This is going to be evaluated by asking questions about strengths and weaknesses, about why you want that role, why you're interested in the organization. They're probably also going to evaluate some of this through nonverbal interaction that you're providing, and maybe even some rapport building or conversation that you make before the interview even starts. They're also going to be evaluating your abilities. Obviously, they want to make sure that you're able to do the job, that you have the qualifications, skills, knowledge necessary to be successful. Qualifications is probably going to look a little bit more into your background, specific knowledge you have around tools or techniques that are necessary for the position. So it's a little bit different than abilities. Abilities are more like skills. Qualifications are more like your background. And then obviously they're evaluating what they think your future performance will look like. If they hire you, what will you be able to do going forward? How will you contribute to the team and the organization? How long are you likely to stay in this position before you are promoted up or before you're tempted to leave the organization altogether? Are you interested in growing with the organization? Are you able to adapt as things change? These are all pieces that they're going to be looking for in the interview. And the way they do that is through a few different types of interview questions. The first type of interview question is just a traditional interview question. These are what we think of when we think of typical interview questions that you'll be asked. Probably things like, tell me about yourself. What is your greatest strength? What is your greatest weakness? As I mentioned earlier, why are you interested in this role? And a lot of times these questions are fairly straightforward. They're asking you these things because they want to know the straightforward answer. They want to know what your strength is. They want to know why you want to work in this position or this role. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to answer a few traditional interview questions in just a moment. But in general, this is just a very common type of interview question. Second type of interview question that you're probably going to encounter quite a bit as well is the behavioral questions. So these questions are usually phrased with a start, something along the lines of, tell me about a time when. We'll talk about this more in depth as well, but usually it's pretty important before you go to an interview to brainstorm some situations where you've performed really well or where you've grown or learned things, so that if you're asked a question about, tell me about a time when, you're able to think of an example fairly quickly because you've already prepared some. And like I said, we'll talk some more about the details of preparing for behavioral questions in just a moment. The third type of interview question that you might encounter is the situational interview question. And this is basically asking you what you would do in a certain situation that is likely something that you might encounter if you were hired for that position. So it gives you a chance to imagine how you would react if you were offered the job, and it gives them an opportunity to see how you might think if you were in that role and you had those responsibilities or those challenges. It also gives them some insight into how well you might already understand the job and the goals of the organization. And so your research that you've done before the interview can play a huge role in you successfully answering one of these situational questions. And then finally, the fourth common type of interview question would be the case interview. And this is when you are given a business scenario and you are asked to work through it. It could be just one prompt. It could be a prompt followed by an additional part or two where they provide you with different or additional information to help inform how you answer the business scenario. You may have time to write out your thoughts. You may be asked to just answer on the spot. These types of interview questions are most often used in a consulting interview or an engineering interview. They might be called whiteboarding questions with an engineering interview, but you may encounter them in any industry, even though they are more common for consulting or engineering. The trick with these case interviews is that you want to be able to articulate your thought process. That's the key. They're not just looking for the answer, they're looking to find out how you got there so they can better understand how you think things through. I'm not going to go into case interviews anymore with our presentation today, but I did want to point out that if you are interested in learning more about case interviews, or you suspect that you may encounter them, you're in a field where they're common, I recommend that you sign up for our Capital One campus-wide case interview prep workshop that's coming up here next week on Tuesday, September 22nd from 12 to 1. You can find more information and RSVP for that event on Hire You Texas, powered by Handshake. All right, so let's dive into finding out why they ask specific questions and how you can craft answers to best represent yourself in the interview. We're going to start with a very common interview question that you are likely to encounter at the beginning of just about every interview that you do, and that is the tell me about yourself question. This question might be phrased slightly differently, so they may ask you to introduce yourself or walk us through a little bit of your background, but regardless of how they phrase it, basically they're asking you to tell them about yourself. And this is a really good opportunity for them to get to know you a little bit more. They may or may not have back-to-back interviews, and if they have back-to-back interviews, they may have looked at a bunch of resumes from a bunch of candidates at the beginning of those interviews, but they may not have had time to review them in between each interview. So it's also a chance for them to be reminded of which candidate you are. It gives you the opportunity to set the tone for the interview. And so they're asking you to introduce yourself so that it can lay the groundwork for the rest of that interview. So how do you go about answering that? You want to make sure that you answer this in 3 parts. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to this next slide here. The first part is going to be a little bit of your background. So you might talk about where you're from, you might talk about your year in school or your major. You may mention a hobby or two or an interest, but you don't have to dive too in depth into your background. So just give them a little bit of an overview as to who you are. That's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer, and this is probably going to be the biggest part of the answer, is to focus on your skills and qualifications. So we're going to go back to the research that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, and we're going to remember how we looked at that job posting that we had saved when we applied, and we identified the skills and qualifications that they're looking for in this position. And this is where you're going to specifically address those skills and qualifications. I recommend identifying what you think are maybe the 3 to 5 most important skills or qualifications, or your strongest skills and qualifications that relate to this position, and very briefly touching on each one, maybe providing a brief understanding of how you've developed or utilized that skill or that qualification. You're probably going to talk about all of these skills and qualifications in much greater depth a little bit later on in the interview, but this gives you a chance to make it fresh in their head. They've just heard you say that you have all these skills and qualifications. The skills and qualifications that you've said are exactly from the job posting. It's exactly what they're looking for. And so this is an important piece to make sure you don't skip. The third part of this answer is when you explain your connection to the position, why you are interested in this role, why you're excited to be talking to this organization. And it can be as simple as saying, based on the skills and qualifications, as well as the mission that I've learned about your organization, as I've been researching you more, I'm very confident that my background and my abilities line up well with this role, and I'm so excited to be talking to you all about this today. And that's a perfect way to connect to the position, the perfect way to end this answer. I have seen many people answer this question, and they get a little bit thrown off because they don't know exactly what the employer wants to hear. Tell me about yourself is a very broad question, and so they'll just start saying things about themselves. Maybe they'll tell a lot about their personal interests and hobbies, but not anything about their work experience or skills. Maybe they will touch on a little bit of their skills and qualifications, but they won't know how to finish the answer, and so they'll just trail off. And that's not really the best way to start an interview. If this is your first question, you are setting the tone for your interview, and if you can answer this confidently and with composure, you're going to feel better. They're going to feel better because they know you're comfortable, and it's going to make them comfortable. So make sure that you always have an answer prepared for this question. All right, let's look at another question. Why are you interested in this organization or this position? Well, they're probably asking you this because they want to know that you did your research, right? If you've done your research, you are indicating to them that you are truly interested in the role. There are a lot of times that folks are just applying for jobs because they are looking for anything, and they don't necessarily care about that particular position or that particular organization. And so when they get asked a question like this, it's really easy to see, oh, they must not be truly interested because they weren't able to talk at all about what we're about or what this position is about. So you want to make sure that you stand out, that you aren't confused with the folks who aren't actually interested. You are showing you truly care about the role, you've taken the time to do the research, and you also understand what you're getting yourself into. You understand the responsibilities, you understand the scope of the position because you've read that job posting, you've done a little bit of research, maybe you've looked up people who have that same position on LinkedIn to see what their LinkedIn profiles say about it. But it's important for them to know that you understand the scope of the role, because if you do before you start the position, you're probably more likely to stay with them. They don't want to hire somebody who didn't fully understand the role and then gets into it and realizes they don't really like it or they're not really good at it and then leaves, and then they have to start a search all over again. So this is an opportunity for you to show you really understand what this position is. So how should you answer? Well, obviously, and this ties into what I was just saying, you should show that you've done your research and you should demonstrate sincere interest. Remember, they're asking every candidate this question. And so if you just think of a general, I really like this organization because I think they do really cool things for customers and this position sounds really challenging. That's not a really unique answer, and some of the other candidates might say something similar, and it doesn't help you to stand out at all. So truly reflect on, why are you interested in this role? Why are you interested in this organization? And the more specific you can be with that, the more your answer is going to stand out. Also, if you're making things up, if you're not sincere about your interest, they're probably going to pick up on that pretty quickly. So don't say something just because you think it sounds good, but that's not actually true for you. All right. Here is another very common interview question. What is your greatest strength and greatest weakness? And you might get asked this together in one question, or it might be asked in two separate questions. What is your greatest strength? What is your greatest weakness? Regardless, why are they asking you this? Well, for the strength piece, they're wanting to see if you can excel in the role. For any position, there's always going to be a few skills that are the most important, that will really help someone to be highly successful. And they want to know if you have a strength that's going to allow you to be that highly successful candidate. They're asking you about your greatest weakness because, well, for two reasons, most likely. First of all, they want to see what your self-awareness is. Are you able to evaluate not only where you are strong, but where you need to grow? And are you able to articulate that clearly? And then, are you able to show that you not only identify those areas where you might have a weakness, but are you able to create a plan to overcome that weakness? Are you able to grow as an individual? So how do you answer this? Let's talk about the strengths piece first, because that, I think, is a fun place to start. What is your greatest strength? I recommend, again, that you are very sincere and authentic with your answer here. Don't just pick a random skill from the job description and say, I'm going to say that's my strength. Because they'll probably be able to pick up if you're not being authentic. But truly think about what skills you possess that truly make you well suited for this position. What is your greatest strength? And I recommend you pick something that will enable you to be very successful in the role. So if your greatest strength is public speaking, but the position doesn't have anything to do with public speaking, you may want to think about identifying another true strength for you that actually will impact your ability to be successful. And then I always recommend that you provide an example with that. So don't just say, I have very strong organization skills. That's probably my greatest strength. Say, I have very strong organizational skills. For example, in my last position, I was tasked with completely reorganizing the storage system for all the files from the past 20 years. And this is how I went about doing that. And that's just one example of my organizational skills. So always talk in examples. So how do you answer, what is your greatest weakness? Truly, the theme of my advice today is to be authentic. And I am keeping with that trend with my advice for this answer. Don't give them a made-up weakness, or don't, and this is kind of a cliche way to go about answering this, don't give them a strength disguised as a weakness. So there was a while there where people were answering, what is your greatest weakness, with an answer like, oh, I'm a perfectionist. I love things to be too perfect. And so I just work really hard to make sure everything is perfect. Well, if I'm a supervisor, on the surface, that sounds like a great thing for my employee to be. It's not actually a weakness. So you're not showing me that you're very self-aware with that answer. But let's say you really do struggle with moving on from projects because you want to make sure they're really perfect, and that causes you issues. You could frame your answer along the lines of, I tend to focus on my projects and go into great detail until I feel like they are truly the best they can be, and sometimes that slows me down, and so I'm unable to move on from there. Now that is a true weakness. But I'm not just going to leave it at that, because I'm going to give them my weakness, and then I'm going to tell them how I have identified strategies for addressing that weakness. If my weakness is I can't move on from things because I'm fixating on making them absolutely perfect, then I better come up with some ways that I can overcome that. Maybe I give myself an allotted amount of time to work on projects, and then I take a step back and move on to something else, and then come back to the original project a few hours later to see if it really does need to continue to be worked on, or if I was just fixating. And then once I've provided some strategies for addressing that weakness, I'm going to give them a very quick example of how I've recently utilized one of those strategies to overcome that weakness. So I'm saying this is still a weakness that I have, but because I've identified some strategies, I've been able to start to overcome it in certain scenarios, which will tell the interviewer or the employer that you're growing and you're working on things. And while this is a weakness, and you recognize that it's a weakness, and it could be something that they see if they hire you, it's also something that you're actively working on and trying to grow in. All right. Why are they asking what salary do you have in mind? This is a difficult question, and it can be a little bit frustrating, not just for students, but for any job seeker, because it feels like it's a really loaded question. If I give you an answer that's too high, are you going to eliminate me from the candidate pool? If I give you an answer that's too low, are you going to offer me a salary that is way below market value because I gave myself a lower salary to start with when you asked me this? But really, the reason that they're asking this question is likely just to determine if you have reasonable expectations for that type of a role in that field. And if you don't, then that might indicate that you don't fully understand that position or that industry. And so you want to make sure that if this question does come up in an interview, you don't get caught off guard. You don't panic and just shout a random number. So along those lines, the way that you answer it is you back up your answer with research. Always recommend before going into any interview, you have looked at a few different salary calculator websites to determine what type of a salary they recommend. Take into account the industry, the location, your years of experience, your degree level. All of those things will impact what type of a salary you are likely to earn. And so make sure you've done research with those factors in mind. Also make sure that you look at more than just one website, because sometimes they get their information from different places. So sometimes those numbers can be quite a bit different. But if you look at a few different sites, get a few different salary numbers, you can start to get a sense of, okay, what might actually be reasonable as far as a number to ask for. And when you answer this question, I recommend that you always provide a range, not a specific number. So don't say, I am looking for $45,000 a year salary, but maybe you say something along the lines of, I would be looking for a salary within the range of $43,000 to $50,000 a year. And when you say that, make sure you back it up with evidence. So based on the research that I've done, I looked at a few different sites online, calculating in my level of experience, your industry, our location. This is the range that I think seems the most reasonable. But it's also completely fair to add onto that answer a qualifier. So to say, this is what I've found based on the research. However, as I learn more about the role and the responsibilities, I'll take that into account as well. And I trust you, should I be offered a position, to provide a number that would be a good number for both of us. And that sets the stage for you to come back to it and negotiate a little bit later if you do get that offer. And as a little side note, if you do have an offer and you want to learn more about how to negotiate that offer, I recommend that you schedule an appointment with one of the career advisors in your college's career center or at Texas Career Engagement, and we can walk you through the process of evaluating an offer and negotiating if that's something that you would like to pursue. All right, so one of the last questions that you will likely always be asked in an interview is, what questions do you have for us? Or do you have any questions for us? They are asking you this for two reasons. Number one, this is another chance for you to show your understanding of the role and the research that you've done about the role in the organization. And two, it's an opportunity for them to provide you with information that you need to know when you are evaluating if this position is a good fit for you. I know this is probably advice that you hear a lot, and it may not sound, it may sound too good to be true, quite honestly, but you're evaluating that employer the same way that employer is evaluating you. You are determining if they would be a good fit, if you would want to accept an offer from them. Just because you're offered a position does not mean you have to take it. So them giving you a chance to ask some questions at the end of the interview gives you a chance to determine whether or not this is something you would want to pursue. So how do you prepare? Well, you make sure that you create some questions beforehand. I always recommend that students have between 5 to 7 questions ready to go. You probably won't get through all of them, but it's a good idea to have those ready just in case you do have a little bit of extra time at the end of the interview. Feel free to write those down and bring them in with you, or if you're doing a Zoom interview, have them on a document that you pull up when they ask you this question. You do not have to have your questions memorized for them, because you're the interviewer a little bit. You do want to make sure that your questions are research informed, so don't ask them something that you could easily find on the website or on the internet somewhere. But let's say that you did a little bit of research and you saw on their website that they support community charitable efforts, but it didn't say anything more about that, and that's something that's really important to you. You can ask them in the interview. I saw this on your website. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what this looks like at this organization. What does that mean? How does this position get to play a role in that charitable giving? I also encourage you to truly think about what is it that you need to know before you accept this offer if you are offered the position. Do you have questions about how you'll be trained if you start? If you've never done that job before, what does the onboarding process look like? How do they make sure that you're up to speed? Maybe you want to know how often you're evaluated, or how often you would get to meet with your boss, or what the team looks like that you'd be working on. What is the culture of the specific team that you would be a part of? Those are all very good things to know before you accept an answer or accept an offer. And so don't be afraid to have those types of questions worked into your questions to ask them as well. All right, so before we finish today, I did want to talk a little bit about those behavioral questions. So tell me about a time when questions. These are incredibly common. You are going to encounter these types of questions in almost all interviews, because the employer or the interviewer is using your past behaviors to determine how you may perform in a future setting. So let's look at a few examples of behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when you took initiative on something. Could be an example. They want to know, what is your drive? What is your motivation? When will you step up? What does it look like when you step up? Tell me about a time when you failed and share what you learned. I love this question because I think it's a really hard question to answer just off the top of your head. And I have asked this to many students in mock interviews over my time in career services. And I can tell you that a lot of times this one will stump students. And I don't blame them. I would be stumped as well. But this question is great because it gives the employer an opportunity to hear a little bit about that self-awareness, about your ability to grow and learn from places where you've made mistakes, where you've messed up. And so obviously that's a hard thing to think about in an interview, because we're probably thinking a lot about sharing times we've done really well. And so having some examples of times when you've succeeded, but also when you maybe haven't succeeded and how you've grown, can be really helpful in your preparation. Tell me about a time when you dealt with conflict on a team. You tell me how you've done that in the past, I can possibly project how you're going to perform on my team if there's conflict, and what I can expect from you if I'm your supervisor and something doesn't work out, or you have an issue with somebody on the team or with me. So that's why I would ask you that one. Tell me about a time when you reached a goal and share how you contributed to that success. I want to know what are your strengths? Not just me asking you what are your strengths, but you actually telling me what that looks like, what the outcome is, and how much of an impact have you been able to have in past jobs or internships or clubs and organizations or group projects in a class even. You can pull these examples from anywhere, but I do recommend that you have a few prepared before the interview. So when you're answering these behavioral-based questions, we recommend that you use a format called STAR formula. STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. And as you're generating examples that you might use in behavioral questions, I recommend that you do so using this formula. So you think of the situation, think of the task, you think of the action, you think of the result. So, excuse me. So situation is giving a little bit of background. What was your role? Were you working as a team member for a class project? Were you an intern at a local nonprofit? What was the situation? The task is the responsibility that you had, or the problem that you encountered, or the thing that you had to do. And the action is how you address that task. So if it was a problem, that was the task. The action is how you solved it. If it's a responsibility that you had with your task, the action is how you went about meeting that responsibility. And the R, the result, is the outcome. The so what? What was the impact? If you can quantify it with numbers, percentages, dollars, anything like that, great. But if you can't, don't worry, because there's still an impact. If you had a task and you responded to that task with an action, there was a result, there was an outcome, and that's where you share that here. So let's look at an example. Let's say that I'm asked a behavioral question about a time when I had to do some problem solving. This is an example that I might provide. So I would first start with S. And as I go through this and as I answer the interviewer, I'm not going to say situation, task, action, result. I'm not going to label that I'm going through this formula, but in my head, I'm going to move through it that way. So I'm going to start with the situation. And let's say that I was an events intern for a local meeting venue. And so I helped assist the events manager with any upcoming conferences or events that were happening at this venue. The task for this particular example is that I was charged with creating a seating layout and a seating chart for an upcoming event that was coming up. And last minute, just a few days before the RSVP deadline, the RSVPs increased by 20%. And all of the work that I put into creating this seating chart went out the window because all of a sudden there were so many more participants that were going to show up. So I needed to create a brand new seating chart with only 1 week to spare before the event. So how did I respond? What was my action? Well, I worked with the caterer to figure out that we could move the buffet table outside of the event space into the hallway, which would provide a little bit more room for us to put a few more seats in. I also was able to work with the caterer to figure out how we could put plates and silverware on the table that wouldn't take up quite as much space, so we could fit 1 extra chair at each of the tables. And based on that, I was able to rearrange the seating chart. So the result is that all the attendees were able to fit into the upcoming event without any problem. Nobody even knew there had ever been any disruption, and there were no concerns. That might be one way that I walk through the STAR formula if I'm providing an answer to a behavioral question. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of an understanding on how you might prepare for some of those interview questions and why the interviewer might be asking you some of these things. Don't forget that it's your job to show them why you are the best fit for this organization, and you have to start by believing that yourself. You have to truly understand why you would be a good fit for this organization, because if you can't connect those dots for yourself, the employer is certainly not going to be able to connect those dots for you. So make sure that you can articulate that well. I did want to, before we move into any questions that might have come through or that you might have at this point, I did want to point out a few other events that we have coming up this semester that can be helpful. So we have a few different webinars and panels. These are some that are coming up in September and October. Developing resilience, learn to thrive in challenging times would be a great one if you are struggling with applying for jobs or internships. You're maybe not sure where to go from here, feeling a little stuck. That would be a fantastic one to attend. I want to highlight our creative strategies to envision and achieve career goals. I get to think in some really creative ways around what's important to you, what your goals are for your career, and come up with some really fun ways to articulate that. Grad school panel, if you're thinking of grad school, I highly recommend you attend this. We get to hear from grad students currently about what they have learned through grad school, what they wish they had known before they applied, what their recommendations are. And we have a webinar on resume writing that's also coming up. Just a few more. I'll just highlight here. I am doing another one on informational interviewing. So this flips the roles a little bit. Informational interviewing is when you are the interviewer and you are interviewing a professional to get information. So we'll talk about how you go about doing that in October. And then we have a fantastic first generation town hall for first generation students, hearing from alumni who were first generation as well. All of these events are in Higher U Texas, powered by Handshake. We have a career confidence group and mindfulness happening every Tuesday from 1 to 2. You can register for that in Handshake. And we also have drop-in hours. If you have a resume or cover letter you'd like somebody to review, starting September 28th, we will have people that you can talk with without scheduling an appointment in the evenings, 5 to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. All right, and finally, if you are interested in learning more about interviews or practicing an interview, I recommend you contact your college's Career Center to schedule an appointment, or you can go into Higher U Texas, powered by Handshake, and schedule a mock interview appointment with Texas Career Engagement. All right, so if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in right now. Give just a few minutes for us to see if any of those come in. Okay, perfect, so we do have one. How do you go about taking time to think about your answer and not be uncomfortable in silence or making the employer wait for your answer? I am so glad someone asked this question because I think this is really important. I promise you, it's going to feel more awkward for you as the interviewee than it is for the interviewer. But it is so important that if you are asked a question and you do not have an answer right away, that you take a few seconds to figure out where you want to go with your answer before you start talking. I have done a lot of interviews and even more mock interviews, and I will tell you, very rarely, if ever, probably never, do I remember after the interview's over that somebody took a few seconds before they started answering. That just, as soon as you start talking, I forget that you were quiet for a second. But I will always remember the answers of the candidates who just started rambling because they didn't know what they wanted to say, but they were too afraid of being quiet for a second. So this is a skill that's going to take practice, especially if you are, I feel like it's even harder to do if you're on a phone. So that's why I would recommend doing some practice interviews with your career advisors or your career counselors or coaches in Texas Career Engagement, because it's such an important skill to be able to use, but it can take a little bit to get comfortable with it. It's a great question. Any other questions from folks? See, I am using silence right now. I'll just sit here and wait for some more questions. Oh, how do you recover from an awful answer? Now that's a great question as well, because once you feel like you have messed up an answer, you're going to be fixating on that, right? And it's probably going to trip you up going forward if you let it. So the best thing you can try to do is to shake it off and truly try to think of each question as a fresh start. And if you can get back on track, if you have one answer where you missed the mark a little bit, but the rest of your answers were really good, that may not be important at all to the employer. I know that I personally have had interviews where I have felt like there was one question that really threw me off and I didn't answer it well, but I didn't let that throw me off in the rest of the interview. And I thought for sure I would not be selected to move forward, and I was. And I feel like there are probably a lot of professionals who have a similar experience. And so don't take it too hard. Don't let it mess up the rest of the interview for you. Just try to finish this, with as much strength as possible. Recognize that you're human. They recognize that you're human. And all you can do is your very best from there. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record here, but I do think that practicing your interviews and practicing recovering from those difficult questions where you may not have answered your best is really the key. And so sign up for those mock interviews. Okay. Can interviewers tell you're nervous, and is that detrimental to your prospects of moving forward? Well, it depends on how you show that you're nervous. I think, again, going along the lines of them recognizing that you're human, it's very common and totally normal to be a little bit nervous for an interview. The problem is going to be is if that nervousness prevents you from feeling like you're able to answer really well. And so I recommend that you figure out personally what strategies work best for you and you're in a situation that makes you nervous. I've had some folks who have found it to be really helpful to do power poses. So they will get to an interview a few minutes early and they'll maybe go into the bathroom before they check into their interview and just stand in a power pose. I've also had folks who have pushed against a wall for like a minute and push as hard as you can. And that helps get that blood flowing and can maybe move some of that adrenaline through your body a little bit. But whatever it is that's a key for you, whether it is taking a moment to do a little bit of mindfulness and centering, whether it is practicing your interview answers on the way to the interview, a few deep breaths, figure out what strategies work well for you and recognize that nerves are okay. And sometimes when we're a little nervous, we perform at our very best. So we don't want to totally eliminate nerves, but we do want to make sure it doesn't prohibit you from doing your very best work. Okay, so I have two questions here that are very similar. What should I say if I blank out for a question, such as tell me a joke because I'm in a stressful situation? Or then I have another question, any tips for situational questions where you can't really think of an example or answer from your experience? So these are similar. I think they both relate to what do I do if I get asked something and I don't know what to do? First piece of advice would be to take those few seconds before you answer to quiet your mind and think, do I have an answer for this question? Even if it's not something you've prepared, maybe you can think for a second if there was an example or a situation where maybe you would be able to answer that question. You just need to think for a second. So don't feel like you have to start talking right away. But let's say you truly have no idea what kind of an example to provide. Let's say they're asking you a behavioral question and it's for a situation you have never encountered. I think it is completely fine to say, honestly, I've never experienced that exact thing. However, if I were in that type of situation, I imagine this is how I would respond. Or even better, to say, I've never been in that exact situation, but I do have an example that is somewhat related, and I'd like to share that with you and then maybe talk a little bit about how that might relate to how I would respond in that type of a situation. So if you don't have the exact perfect answer, just do the best you can with the experiences that you have or project how you think you might answer. Now, what should I say if I blank out for a question such as tell me a joke? There was actually kind of a trend for a while of interviewers asking really odd interview questions to see how candidates would think, and it would sometimes throw folks off their game a little bit. So tell me a joke. If you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? Questions that didn't seem to pertain to the position itself. I think in my experience, the best way to do that is to take a few seconds. And if you feel like you're going to need more than just a few seconds, it is completely fine to say, wow, that's a great question. I'm going to take just a second to think about it and to actually articulate that you're thinking or that you're going to need a moment to collect your thoughts rather than just sitting there. But there are always going to be some of those interviews where they throw a question at you and you have no idea where that came from or why they're asking it because it feels very just off point. But do the best you can to compose yourself. And maybe, after taking a few seconds, something will come to your mind. But those questions are really hard. And the best thing I can say is take a second, take a breath, do your best. And if you don't feel like you answer it well, move on. Do not let that throw you off for the rest of the interview. Because if you get asked that question in an interview, tell me a joke, and you don't know where to go with that, but the rest of your interview answers are awesome, they're going to have a really hard time justifying why they didn't move you forward just because you couldn't tell them a joke on the spot. So don't let that throw you off. Great questions, everyone. We have time for maybe one or two more if anyone else has a question. And my colleague Hannah just put a really helpful link into the chat function. She's linked us to Big Interview. This is an interview practice tool that allows you to record your interview answers and watch them back and see how you did. It also gives you a chance to watch a number of videos that provide advice on answering specific interview questions. You can select interview questions specific to your industry or your area of interest. So if you have an interview coming up for an elementary school teaching position, you can go in and select teaching interview questions, and it will give you education interview questions, or you can do the same for really any industry, finance, accounting, med school. So definitely recommend you jump into that tool as well. All right, well, I think that's just about all the time that we have today. Thank you all so much for joining us. And if you have any questions or you need any further assistance, I will one more time recommend that you schedule an appointment with your career advisor at your college or through Texas Career Engagement. Stay safe, everyone. Good luck with the start of school, and good luck with your upcoming interviews.